welcome everyone. My name is Rahwa Yohaness. I am the editor of Afrika.no. It's an online magazine that's published by the Norwegian Council for Africa. Today we have the pleasure of Herbjørnsrud and the editors of the Hatata inquiries, and in launching the book, and we're very honored. So we have the editors. We have Ralph Lee from Oxford University, Wendy Belcher from Princeton, of course. We have Jeremy Brown, and we have Mehari Worku. So all these people have contributed their part in making this book happen. We're going to be talking about Norwegian academia on the global context as well. So I'm going to say welcome to Dag. You can please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, right. So I was lucky enough to write the preface of this great book, which is just launched, and I just got it in the mail yesterday. So this book is about African philosophy from Ethiopia in the 1600s. And for me personally, at least, it started some 6 years ago when I was reading this book, a Norwegian translation of the Hatatas. The translation is made by Radulf Molvær, who is in the audience today, actually. And that made me write a text about these philosophical texts. Now, I would just first say that in theory, or from a European perspective, I would say that this book is not possible. Seriously, because from a European or colonial perspective, or from a Eurocentric and colonial perspective, and I try to touch upon this in the preface, these African texts shouldn't be possible because Sarah Jacob and Walda Hayward, the two authors, they argue that we should use our rationality when we, confront texts and religions or the society as such, And from a Eurocentric colonial perspective, as it is presented at universities today, the European Enlightenment should be the starting point for such thoughts. So there has been a huge debate for the last 120 years about these texts. They were rediscovered in 1903, and now finally they are published in English in Europe and the US. But another perspective is to have more of a global perspective, and a more scientific perspective, And then in that case, these texts, I will claim, are not that, how to say, surprising or shocking or impossible. Rather, they are more natural. To take an even more extreme example, which I mentioned in my preface, I have some book series, so you just have to stop me. But okay, so just to take an extreme example from India, this is a collection of texts from the Indian atheist school, or actually there are several schools of this atheist agnostic thinking. So it's called Charvaka or Lokayata. Lokayata is Sanskrit, and Loka means the world. So Lokayata means worldly or amongst the people. And this is a 2,700 years old tradition, in India. and it has been probably, or most likely, influencing the Greeks when Pyrrho went with Alexander the Great to India 2,300 years ago. So, and from this perspective, this is much more radical and impossible than these Hatatas of Ethiopia, right? But these texts of Indian atheism is also excluded from the European canon. That's a rather, by the way, new tradition, which to exclude both women and non-European men from the canon. That's a rather new tradition, starting in the early 1800s, described in this book by Peter K.J. Park at Texas University. So he describes how this new Kantian and Hegelian tradition started in the early 1800s. And so everything is excluded, including these more extreme, how to say, atheist thinking atheist schools of India. Another example, by the way, I also mentioned in the preface, is the Chinese philosopher Mo Zi. And he was born in the year 470 before the Common Era. That's actually a year earlier than Socrates. And he was writing about universal love, was his tradition called Muhism. Or in Chinese, or in Free Hong Kong, we say Yian Ai, which means universal love. And personally, I think that concept actually resembles what, especially Walter Hayward, who has written this second text in this new translation. He is also rather close to this thinking about universalism and not only love thy neighbor, but also people from different cultures and around the world. So that's another example, which is even more surprising than these Hatatas, actually. And then if you go back to Egypt, actually, 3,200 years ago, the African civilization of Egypt you also have many texts that are very surprising, so to say, from a modern perspective. There is a text called Be a Writer, which is 3,200 years old, and he says, don't care about your family, don't care about the gods, don't care about the temples, do only care about the texts that you write, because those texts will live forever. And while so that's very radical. It says, forget everything except writing, you know. That's also excluded from the rather new canon in the Western, so-called Western academia. And finally, I still have a minute, really? Oh, great. Because then I can actually also say some words about this text, which was recently in 2020 translated and published by Oxford University Press. And it's written of another African, Anton Wilhelm Amo, born approximately 1703. And he was actually kidnapped from Axim in Ghana and brought to the middle of Germany. And he was given a rather good education, and he published books in Latin, and he wrote in Latin in 1734 and 1738. But it took 280 years before these texts, written in the middle of Europe, written in Latin, and and the topic was like Descartes and Cartesian theory. And, it took 280 years. So in that respect, I mean, this took only like 120, since it was rediscovered in 1903. So, it's not that bad. But it shows what these examples demonstrate how, how much is excluded from the canon of today. And finally, where were I? And there is another example that Wendy might not mention, so I did, because she has, published this great book about Wallata Petros. And that's another great example, which is, how to say, impossible for a traditional European perspective to, understand. But this is a book written approximately 1668 as well. And it's a biography written by a man about a woman, living in the 1600s. And so I would recommend this book as well, in order to understand the context of the Ethiopian tradition. And in my preface, I do also mention the Stephanites of the 1400s as another example of, this great critical tradition of Ethiopia. So, so it means that this book should not be a surprise. Rather, personally, as far as I can see from, the great work made by others, like the experts up on the screen here, I think this is a very natural book from an Ethiopian perspective, and I look forward to more info from you and the others.
Well,
again,
yeah, thank you. Well, not necessarily for me. We have the experts here, so thank you so much. That was Dag Herbjørnsrud, global historian of ideas. And now I think we will go to you, Wendy. Or would you like to go?
Ralph.
Ralph. Okay.
Yeah, Ralph
right.
goes.
Then I think Dr. Ralph Lee from the University of Oxford will be presenting a little bit about his journey in doing this work.
Okay. First of all, a disclaimer: I don't work for the University of Oxford. I work for the Oxford Centre for Mission Studies, which is in Oxford, but I live in Cambridge, which makes it even more complicated. But it doesn't matter in one sense. So thank you for this really good opportunity to talk about various aspects of this book, and I want to start off with by just saying that I regard the Ethiopian tradition and the Ge'ez literature of Ethiopia, as well as Amharic literature, as being seriously understudied, seriously underrepresented in forms that allow it to be accessible to people who haven't had the opportunity to learn the languages. And then that leads to something very obvious that Wendy and others will deal with in more detail, that we need to resist the temptation to over-define and categorize the literature, because actually we don't really understand the full context in which it sits. And as Dag has already mentioned, not just in Ethiopia, but monastics or those connected with the monastic tradition. We're not sure that Zara Yacob was a monk. In fact, he says that he's not in the book, although he pretends to be one. They are often, they have unusual ideas. They express what could be regarded as rebellious ideas, particularly in their communications with each other. I read Ge'ez most days of my life, and I'm constantly encountering topics and themes and stylistic approaches that I've not seen before. I do not claim in some aspects of the language to be as proficient as some in philology. But I think what we've tried to do here is make some progress in trying to understand the text in an accessible way within its context. And the team that have worked together on this have made that possible. The danger of over-categorizing, I think, in the process of studying Goethe's literature means that we end up, we draw conclusions by shoving something into a category, and then our conclusions are only consistent with our category rather than with the literature as we find it. And in that sense, as Dag has already said, these works perhaps shouldn't be surprising. I think that they are, we can call them unusual, and I think Mehari is going to talk much more about these works in the context of Ethiopian literature, so I'm not wanting to steal his thunder at all. I'm going to restrict myself there to say that they certainly are works of a kind that I've not seen. And those scholars who have carefully gone through many, many works in Goethe are probably right that there is nothing quite else like them. So we've had many people survey types of literature in Goethe and see the broad sort of categories. They seem to sit, in one sense, maybe aside from others. But we can't see them as completely outside the tradition. The characters clearly identify themselves as the authors, as people who know Ethiopian tradition. They are immersed in that tradition, even if they express ideas that are radically different from the core of Ethiopian Christian thinking. They follow the natural path of those trained within the Ethiopian education system would take in seeking answers to questions. That is the starting point for philosophical questioning, for looking for answers, are the scriptures of the Christian tradition. And in this case, primarily by far, the Book of Psalms. While some of the answers that Zoe Jacob and Walter Hayward come up with that might be regarded as unusual, they certainly start from familiar places and start with texts with which people imbibed in the Ethiopian tradition would be very, very familiar. I want to say a little bit about the process of translation, because I think I'm personally very pleased with what we've ended up with, but it wasn't a straightforward process. And I regularly encounter people that tell me that translation is easy, and I don't agree with them. But the process itself has been tremendously enriching. Wendy must be given the credit for seeing, if you like, the significance of the work and how an English translation might be helpful for both those who study Ethiopia, but also those who study thought and philosophy outside the Ethiopian tradition. And so those who are interested more broadly in non-Western outlooks. I think if it had been left up to me alone, we would have had a rather wooden translation. The number of times Wendy has said to me in the process, but you can't say it like that, Ralph. And I would say, but it means that. But okay, but you can't say it like that. Or some words to that effect. The conversation over translation has been incredibly important, because that by doing that, we've ended up with things that I think are very clear in English and are as faithful as we can make them to the original Goethe. Translation is an inherently terrifying activity. For sure, people will go through the text and they will find mistakes looking closely at parts of the text, and some of these will need to be acknowledged. But I think one thing that I've always tried to be careful of, because of course Sumner did translate them into English, and they were published in Addis Ababa. And there are certain shortfalls of that translation, but I'm not willing to be too critical of the first one to have the courage to put a translation into English. It's very easy to criticize a translation and fail to appreciate how much work it is when nothing like this has ever been translated before. He must be credited with that. I'm rather less interested in identifying mistakes than in learning from another translation. and seeing how it can be improved. And maybe we can say that it's been improved by understanding the context in new ways. Maybe too, we've looked, particularly working together with Mehari, at understanding grammar and vocabulary in new ways. I think we discover very quickly that the dictionaries available to us in English are in some way inadequate. For those of us that can read Amharic, there's a dictionary written by Kadana Waldekifli with the definitions in Amharic, which have a much richer, particularly when it comes to theology and spiritual angles. I recall not a word that comes up in this book, but the word tabut, referring to the Ark of the Covenant, by Leslau, his first definition is box. And Kadana Waldekifli's first definition is the mystery of divine presence and indwelling. I think that speaks for itself. So I think we have to search for meaning. We have to search for those meanings and those associations within the tradition, because that's where that vocabulary has come from. We've also identified many, many more quotations, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I talk about the Psalms. And that's perhaps less remarkable than it seems. I marvel at Victorian and later scholars who identify allusions and quotations, because finding them must have been a nightmare. Now we have electronic text, it's much easier because you can search for things and find the words. We developed a habit of, when we found a sentence which seemed a little bit unusual in its grammar or in its place in the text, to go straight to my copy of the accordance software and look for words, and often found them to be allusions or quotations. One of the true insights from the translation is the extent to which the authors do depend on the Bible, and particularly the Book of Psalms. The long dialogue with Wendy was further augmented when Mehari was brought in. And it's hard for us to comprehend, I think, as Westerners, the way in which traditional scholars are trained in Ethiopia, and the way that that gives them access to all sorts of material. And Mehari represents the product of that tradition in a very, very important way. And without that input, the work would have been deficient, I think. I think it's also important to say that the three of us had some significant disagreements. We never came to blows over it, but that's probably because we were on Zoom. And one or two, most of them we resolved. One or two are preserved in the form of footnotes, where we really couldn't come to an agreement, and we had to decide, well, we'll put this in the text and we'll put that one in the footnote. And that just represents the fact that it is hard to understand some things. And I think it's okay to have things expressed in that way. But I think we're still friends, so that's important. Just as a final sort of section, I think it's very important for me, because of the work and how it's thought of, that we identified more than 3 times the quotations from the Bible that had previously been identified. And as I say, we can thank digital text for that as much as anything. Interesting as well that many of the quotations are not word for word. They are often personalized. So when a third person is used in the psalm, the authors use it in the first person and make it personal. We can't, of course, know exactly what text of the Psalms the authors were referring to, but we do know from work that Jeremy and myself have been involved with over many years that the text of the Psalms is pretty stable. So we don't see large numbers of variations over many centuries. So I think the personalization is an act on the part of the writer to make them speak for himself. Interesting as well is perhaps that of the 155 identified quotations, compared to the 49 in the original critical edition, there are 3 psalms that dominate: Psalms 73, 116, and 119, and that's in the Hebrew numbering. The knowledge of the Psalms is of a particular kind, one that is perhaps not unusual for Christian writers, but very, very important to stress that a quotation from the scriptures does not necessarily indicate a restricted reference to a particular text. So quite often it was a habit amongst many patristic writers that if they quoted the first line of a psalm, it's very clear when they, in their further comments, that what they mean is the whole psalm. So we found it in one or two places necessary to add an interpolation that implies that. And particularly one that comes to mind is from Psalm 73, where you'll see in Sumner's translation a slightly awkward statement. How can God know? And we're asking the question, well, what on earth is he knowing, if you see what I mean? When you read the psalm, and we've inserted in square brackets, how can God know about human depravity? That's clearly the context of that question within the context of the psalm and the parts of the psalm that come before. And then he's able to say, is there knowledge of the Most High? Human depravity is added because it's not in the text, but the context demands it. Yaakov, I've got a couple of minutes, have I?
Yeah.
Yaakov places himself often in place with the psalmist and identifies as asking those questions, but he also quite often puts himself in the person of the wicked or the people that are being attacked in the language of those psalms. I think it's interesting as well that while Haywatt uses a much more diverse list of quotations from different books, exactly why is not clear, but it has a slightly different outlook. But he is drawn to the Psalms and their form to the extent that he also creates his own psalm. So if you look in chapter 11 on page 128, there's a text which I was convinced when I first read it was a quotation from the Psalms, but I haven't found it anywhere. I think it's Walter Haywood creating a psalm-like text with one or two quotations, but mostly text himself. Despite the attraction for the Christian scriptures, it is worth noting that both authors show contempt for certain parts of the scriptures. So the rules and regulations of Leviticus are not spoken highly of. And Yaakov thinks very little, he thinks a lot of some of the things that Moses wrote, but doesn't think very highly of all the miracles that are attributed to Moses. Walter Haywood does seem to indicate that his desire is for some kind of union with his creator, but neither of the authors makes significant reference to central tenets of Christian doctrine. So the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ isn't a big feature in this text. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't believe in those, but it's quite notable that they don't feature in the way that they use the text that they're referring to. So I think what I'm really saying here is that there's an immense amount of work to do in really understanding. You could do a whole PhD on the use of scripture in this text, for instance. You could explore it in all sorts of directions. And in a sense, the translation is only the beginning of being able to do that. You could say a lot more, but I'm not going to. I'm going to hand over to who's next. Is it Mehari next?
All right, thank you. We give him an applause. Thanks a lot, Ralph. Mehari, maybe you want to go next. Let me just introduce him a little bit quick. We're now going to hear from Mehari, Dr. Mehari Worku from the Catholic University of America. Would you like to start?
Thank you, Rahwa, and thank you, Ralph. It really is a delight to talk about this book, because often the discussion about this book for me is on the things that really don't matter that much compared to the content of the book. And what I would like to do in the next few minutes is where is this book in the Ethiopian literary tradition, in the Ethiopian tradition of poesis. And it is, yes, Ralph, I do agree with Ralph. Like this text is, yes, it's unique in many ways in the Ethiopian literary tradition, because as far as we know, we don't have any other philosophical treatise or philosophical book that was written from this period or earlier from this period and was handed down to us to this like that. Yes, that's true. We don't have a book. However, we have to be very careful not to judge from this that, oh, so Ethiopians are not into philosophy or inquiries or thinking about some metaphysical matters. I think that is a very human thing to do. So as long as we agree that Ethiopians are human beings, I think we can take it for granted that Ethiopians definitely have some philosophy, definitely. So yeah, like because there were some back in the days, there were some speculations about, like, this cannot come from Ethiopia. Absolutely. So we definitely disagree. Absolutely disagree with that, because this is just crazy and ridiculous. So where does this Hatata, these texts stand in the Ethiopian literary tradition? Okay, they stand in the Qanebet. Qanebet means this is one of the schools in the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo traditional schooling system. It is the school of poetry, grammar, and even rhetoric. These texts stand in the tradition of Qanebet, or the poetry house. Okay, to give you a little more context, the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church education system, this is a very, very ancient education system that highly emphasizes on memory, and not writing, but memory, and poetry and melody. These are the most important features of Ethiopian education system. And this system has 4 major categories, 4 major schools. The first one, when a young person or a beginner comes to this school, the first school is the reading school, where the student will be exposed into the alphabet, reading the alphabets and reading the epistles of St. John. After the alphabet, those would be the first things to read, and then the Psalter. And the student is not only expected to read these things, but memorize them. If you know the Psalter, the Ethiopic Psalter has 151 psalms, and then in addition to that, it has 15 canticles of the prophets. And the student is required to memorize everything, word for word, verbatim, like all this text in his head or in her head. Okay, and it's only when this happens that the student will be allowed to pass to the next level. Well, this practice comes from the late antique period in the church education system in the Near East, where even bishops were required to be able to memorize the entire 150 psalms, the entire Psalter. And this was the practice in the Ethiopian church, and it still is, even after like the printing industry was introduced into Ethiopia. When you go to reading schools, you will, of course, you don't have, it's not that difficult to acquire a Psalter, a printed Psalter, but because of the amount of recitation that you would have to do it just in the school before you go to the next psalm, you will be able to memorize, if not all, most of the verses in the Psalter, in the Psalms. So this is the reading school. So by the time you are finished in this school, which could take 2 years, 3-4 years for some students, you will surely memorize a lot, like a good portion of the scriptures and most of the Psalter, if not all, and many of the canticles of the prophets. Then the next school that you go to is the melody school, where the student will be exposed to the liturgical melodies of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which are very unique and very ancient, which can be traced at least to traditionally to the 6th century. And in this school, there are so many liturgical materials that one learns to chant, and this will take like if somebody wants to learn the entire liturgical chanting, it will take about 15 years. If not, one can finish the basic. One can cover the fundamental ones in about 3-4 years, and move on to poetry school. The poetry school there is less melody there, but there is melody. If you read the Hatatas, Yaakov clearly tells us that he comes from the poetry school because melody was very difficult for him. And he says, Suhu Gur'e means my throat is very rough. Like that means he's a tone deaf person too, because tone deaf people cannot hear melodies very well, and they can sing well. But he said, like, well, my voice was not that great, so like I couldn't chant. So I moved to the poetry school. I was taken to the poetry school, where one learns grammar and poetry, and memory is again a very significant part of this school. For instance, the Archbishop of New York now, like the current Archbishop of New York, when he was in poetry school, by the time he finished poetry school, he was able to memorize 90 Mawaddis poetry. Mawaddis poetry is a very long poetry. He was able to recite 90 very well-renowned poetries that passed down from one generation to the next generation orally. None of these poetries are written. It passed on from one generation to another generation orally. And this is besides making your own poetry. That's what you learn. Memorizing these poetic the compositions or these poetries is not what you are required. No, these are the models that you follow, but you cannot recite them. You cannot repeat them. It will be considered as plagiarism. So every single time you are asked to give a poem, you will take a turn, and you will definitely have a turn. Every single time you are asked to give a poem, you are expected to come up with new poem that has never been heard, that has never been said by anyone. And if you try to cheat, trust me, somebody will catch you. Because it happened to people. And once he was giving this poetry in church for service, and they heard everything, and everything went well during the liturgical service, and nobody said anything. And as soon as the liturgy was completed, one of the listeners, the audience came and, oh, Mr. So-and-so, how are you? And how was Yeneta, means how was that master who composed that poetry? I really love him so much. And so please say hi to him, say hi to me. So you see, like, people memorize these poems, and they also are required to make these new poems. And to do that, grammar, like the mastery of the grammar and the expansion of the lexical power of the student is very, very much into this curriculum. Then it's after this, this will take about 3 years to be a master. These days, it will take about 3 years. And after 3 years, the student can move on to the next, which is called Andim Tabet, or the commentary tradition, where the student will be exposed to hermeneutics, history, patristic literature, ascetic literature, and of course, memory also here also is a very good part of the curriculum, and the student will memorize whatever hermeneutic aspect of the Bible that he's studying, meaning if he's studying or she's studying the New Testament commentaries, the student will memorize the entire New Testament verbatim in Ge'ez, and also the entire commentary that was given on those verses and the tradition. Okay, so the memory plays a great deal. And so these are the basic four sections of Ethiopian church education. So the Hatata stand in the school of poetry, and Zara Yaakov clearly tells us this. And the people in Enebet, in poetry school, this is a school of creativity, and many masters are known to express their thoughts in a superb eloquence and succinct poetry. The authors of the Hatatas are not unique in this way. They are not. Even their Ge'ez is not even better than other people. NA has been used to express personal, emotional ordeal, emotional excitement, love. Like people can express, like these Kane masters can use the language to express anything. I think to express their thoughts about anything between heaven and earth, and including heaven and earth. For instance, let me give you a couple of examples and I will finish. There is this poetry which goes like, it's just 2 lines. It's called Gubae Kana. It goes like this. We don't even know when, like who authored this poem. It can be translated like this. Dear Lord, you know, it is not just for you to judge sinners. You yourself tell us to love our enemies. How dare you judge sinners? How dare you judge sinners? You tell us to love your enemies, and like our enemies, and you judge your enemies? How is it possible? So look, this comes from Kane. This comes from poetry school. Let me give you another example. Just another example. So I will give you the translation about, like, this is one guy expressing his emotional ordeal. This voice is not for the noise, background noise is not from me. Whoever has that, they can turn it off.
Sorry, it's from here. Apologies.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So it goes like this. By whom can I find the relief from the burden of oppression, so that the cup of death and suffering could pass away from me? This is from Matthew 26:36. Okay, he's just using these verses from the Bible to express his own anguish. My apostle, the light of my eye, has denied me 3 times, like Peter denied Jesus. The diminishment of my body has come upon me like a chariot carrying Sennacherib, my illness to kill me. This is 2 Kings 18. Seeing the armies of Babylon, Jeremiah, my mind became very anxious. This is like a person expressing his own personal emotions through this the poetry. And another one, this will be the last thing I should say. If I speak the truth, he says, this is from the 1800s. We know who said this. This is about a master from the 1800s. If I speak the truth, he said, the people of this world are going to hate me. If I lie, I am terrified of your judgment, Lord. Clearly, silence is better and greater than any of these. Meaning speaking the truth or being judged by you, speaking the truth and being hated by people, or speaking a lie and being judged by God. So like, no, I'm going to keep quiet. And this is the same mentality that we see in Zara Yaakov, in the Hatatas. So this is where the Hatatas stand. This is the tradition, the tradition of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, a school system that gave birth to these 2 texts that we call the Hatatas. And I think I have said enough, and thank you.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks a lot, Mehari. Can you just explain, before we go on, can you just please explain to the audience here what Hatata means?
Definitely. Hatata means inquiry. This is asking. Literally, it means investigating, examining in depth. Okay, that's what it means. So this person is examining. Hatata, like it's seeking for some truth, some fact. So it's inquiry. Inquiry is, I think, a very good translation of that.
Right. Thank you. Now we go on to Dr. Wendy Laura Belcher. Are you ready to go now?
Yes.
Right. Okay. So we have Wendy Laura Belcher from Princeton University.
All right. Greetings to everyone there. Thank you for coming out today. And thank you to Rahwa for hosting this. We're really grateful to you. I thought I should probably back up and say a little bit about how this all came about. Dag actually reached out to me. We didn't know each other and said, these texts are amazing. They need a good translation. It's really hard to get a hold of them. How can people teach them? Whatever. Which I'm very grateful to him for reaching out to me, basically on my work on the Wilata Petros. I myself don't know Ge'ez, and I believe in a collaborative process. I believe that's how you get the best translation. So I reached out to Ralph, and the way that we worked is Ralph did translation, and then he would and I would go through it word by word. And I'm just looking at the English and saying things like, no, but what does it mean? Like, I understand that's the literal translation, but what does it mean? And we worked through every single word, wrestled through all of them. You know, I was very blessed in Ralph being a really gifted translator and also a very generous interlocutor and willing to kind of go through this kind of process. But then we both felt, well, you know, we're not Ethiopians. We don't come out of the church. We really feel like this text really needs to have somebody who is an Ethiopian scholar of Ge'ez, comes out of the tradition, trained in the tradition. So I asked Mehari if he would go through it. And that process was where Mehari had the Ge'ez in front of him, and I was reading aloud in the English translation. And he would stop if he thought, oh, I don't know about that, and so on. And of course, one really remarkable part of this process is that Mehari, of course, this educational system that he's talking about, he comes out of it. So that he would be reading along and he would instantly say, oh, that's from Psalm 81, verse 2. Or, oh, yeah, that's from Sayings of the Philosophers. Or, yeah, this is that Amharic, it's from the Amharic, and it's this proverb that goes like this. Instantly, throughout the text, he's noticing these passages that are coming from the Ge'ez Bible and from Amharic culture. So he, of course, added a tremendous amount to this recognition of these different passages. Then people had not been treating the manuscripts kind of with respect. They didn't pay attention to it. And there were some questions, which I'll go into in a moment, about what was happening with them. And so I invited Jeremy Brown to come in as a philologist. He also is a translator of Ge'ez, but in this case, we were asking him to come in. Can you look at these manuscripts? He has digitized literally tens of thousands of Ethiopian Ge'ez manuscripts. So partly for that reason, but also just other reasons, he's really gifted in looking at manuscripts and understanding them. And he's going to talk about that a little bit. But that's just to give you a sense of how we got here today. So we have these amazing texts of Ethiopian philosophy. But as Dag alluded to in the beginning, from their kind of first introduction into the West, there were questions. So people questioned, were these Hatata inquiries, were they written in the 1600s, or did this European missionary in the 1850s invent them both wholesale? And what I'll just say up front is that all four of us involved in the translation, Dag and Ralph and Mehari and Jeremy, entered this process open to the possibility that this was true, that it was a fake. But all of us emerged from this deep encounter with the text, this deep process that you go through in translation, where you're engaged with every single word and you've looked at every single word over and over again, we all emerge from it saying, these were absolutely authored by Ethiopians. There's not a shadow of a doubt in our minds. And it's that really deep encounter, spending these years with these texts, that makes it really, really clear. And if I can be just super blunt for a moment, when other people are saying, no, it might be this or that, I'm like, we have more authority than them because we have wrestled through every single word. They're coming and spending half an hour with the text and then making some casual remark. And I'm like, no, they do not know it like we know it. And we know it in this deep way. And we are entirely in agreement. So how did this crazy accusation come about that these texts were invented by a European? The text kind of came to light in a scholarly way in the mid-1800s in Ethiopia, but they began to be known in Europe in the early 1900s. And a Russian scholar thought they were extraordinary and began to talk about them as remarkable texts of rational philosophy written by Africans. So none of you will be surprised to hear that this immediately invoked a racist response, right? European scholars, some, immediately began to say, that's impossible. Africans are incapable of being rational, and they're incapable of being philosophical. These are almost direct quotes. And what was happening here is that in direct contradiction of scientific method, they began with the racist premise, it's impossible, and then they searched for the evidence to back that claim up. So they found, I feel it's hard to dignify this with the term evidence, but let's just say that. They found what they consider to be evidence that this Capuchin Italian priest of the 1800s, this man who brought the text to light, to the European attention, that he was the one who invented both these texts wholesale. Now, I'm just going to tell you outright from the beginning, none of this evidence would hold up in a court of law. And still, these texts are under this suspicion that they're these European fakes. So what are these pieces of evidence that they claim? The first is that they claim that the author of the first Hatata inquiry, whose name is Zadi Yacob, was the same as the Capuchin priest's name. However, this was not true in any way. And in fact, they had not done their research carefully, and they really didn't know what his original name was before he became a priest. And his name was not what it said. So his name was Gian Giacomo, or John James. So I ask you, does John James sound like Zadi Yacob? No, it does not. These names are not, in fact, similar. But even if they were, this would not be legally acceptable evidence. It's overinterpreted coincidence. That's what it says. The next one is very similar. They stated that the birthday of the author of the first Hatata inquiry, Zadi Yacob, was the same as this Italian priest's birthday. Well, in fact, they are 2 days apart. But again, even if the two dates were exactly the same, this would not be legally acceptable evidence. It's just an overinterpreted coincidence, and coincidences happen. They then claimed, and this is the part where people start to be like, well, I don't know. They claimed that an Ethiopian Catholic priest wrote a sentence, a single sentence in some private notes of his, that some Ethiopians, he's reporting what he's heard, had seen the first Hatata inquiry, and they say that this Italian guy wrote it. Okay, yeah, that seems bad that we have this. But there are two problems with this. First of all, there's no trace of this note has ever been found by anyone except for the Italian fascist who first made these accusations, the one who said it was impossible for Africans to write these. So if we can suspect an Italian of inventing two whole texts, I think we can certainly suspect an Italian of inventing one single sentence to support his racist case, which he was very invested in supporting because, you know, the war is coming, Italians are trying to conquer Ethiopia, etc. Now, even if the note was found, the word wrote is really interesting because in Ge'ez and Amharic, and Mehari and Ralph can correct me, but the difference between wrote and copied is not that big. It's not that clear always. So for me, I think this is just likely a misunderstanding of what the Italian priest was doing, which was this really weird thing where he himself was copying these parchment manuscripts. And I think they saw this bizarre thing where this European was doing this, and that inspired some people to wonder what's going on there. Maybe he wrote it instead of copying it. I think, again, we do not have this sentence, and I don't think, these are kinds of proof. So the whole case is coincidence in names and birthdays and this hearsay at third hand that no one has ever seen except for the accuser. Others have come along and tried to do a few other things. They've tried to show that the syntax of the texts are, somehow Italian or European, or the diction of the text is somehow European. And in the book, you can read that part. We've disproved all of those. The way they wrote dates, absolutely typical of Ethiopians. The word they use for chapter, absolutely typical of Ethiopians. We can't treat it as evidence anymore. It's now gone. Now, aside from this evidence, this accusation that Italian invented these texts depends on proving two things. One, it depends on proving that the Italian priest had the skills in Ge'ez required to pull off something this good a fig, and that he was the type of person who would do such an appalling thing. So let's take the first one. Just straight up, his skills in Ge'ez are definitely not up to the task. And let's say that they were. Let's say he had superb. By the way, he only spent 5 years in Ethiopia, so he didn't have much time to learn it. But let's say that he did have really good. I can understand a European faking a sentence, a paragraph, maybe even a few pages. But this is what we have in front of us. That a European, this is the idea, the fake idea, it depends on this, that a European spent only 8 months to compose 2 long, well-written, and largely error-free texts without any historical inaccuracies, without any anachronisms, and that depended on a truly massive corpus and knowledge of Ge'ez proverbs, stories, and literature, as well as specific forms of prosody and rhetoric. That's just astronomically high. And one of the reasons that I feel strongly about this and believe this is that I have worked with both Ralph and Mehari on this text. And Ralph lived in Ethiopia for decades. He even taught at the Orthodox seminary in Amharic. Many people have told me that he's very, very gifted in these languages, and he certainly studied them far longer and more carefully than this guy who was there for 5 years and had to invent his own dictionary. He didn't have all this apparatus. So Ralph is this incredibly knowledgeable European. But then Mehari and I started going through this translation, and he has this instant knowledge throughout of what the Proverbs are, the Psalms are, all of this stuff that's memorized. It's just coming out of him. And I'm like, to me, this was a profound proof. If Ralph, one of the best European scholars of Ge'ez ever, could not do what Mehari could do, how could this Italian guy who'd been there for 5 years do it? It just seems to me to be absolutely impossible. So the other thing is the Italian priest's character. And 2 scholars have argued that this guy was dishonest, he was disillusioned, he was faithless, he was bitter, and therefore he had exactly the type of character that could have done this. But for me, this is the very proof that he cannot have faked these texts, because they're really quite joyful, celebratory texts. They are not bitter texts, and they're deeply ethical. They're repeatedly lambasting lying of all sorts. They are not the product of a deeply disturbed mind. So like, this just does not work. And the other thing here is that nobody has ever explained the motivation for doing this, right? What possible reason could this guy have for doing this? I get that inventing it, sure, that might be fun, whatever, but claiming that others wrote it, this is very bizarre. People do, yes, invent fake texts, but they do it basically for 3 reasons. 1, to make money. He never made money and never tried to make money from it. They do it to become famous, either by themselves or by proxy. He never did anything to become famous or draw attention to it or in any way, become anything with it. or to further a political cause. And the only political cause here would be that he wrote them to try and prove that Africans had the capacity to write them, which makes no sense. And he would never have that. He was in the 1800s. This was not. There's really just no reason why he would compose the text and deny that he composed the text. So in terms of the evidence that he did not author it, as I mentioned, the dependence of the text on the Ethiopian oral and written tradition is just vast. There are hundreds of quotes from Psalms, and the way that they're quoted, it's not like they're sprinkled throughout like for flavor. It's they are the engine of the text. It is what is the wording of that wording of the psalm that inspires the thought that comes next. So it is memorized, it is coming out, it is driving this writing. And of course, the other problem is that everyone ignores the second Hatata. They only talk about the first one, and it doesn't work because they're totally different. They're really different texts. And you have to say either he invented both or he invented neither of them. And once you look at these and you see how dramatically different they are, you see, okay, not one person cannot have done this. Also, you know, the author of these texts are making statements that no European would ever make. One of them says, why do all human beings agree that there is a God? This is not a sentence that a European would ever write. No, they know, everyone knows the long tradition of atheism. They know lots of people don't believe there is a God, so that's unlikely. Then Mehari pointed out, I think brilliantly, that the texts proceed without any knowledge of the history of Christian theology or the way in which, you know, European theology has thought about things. One of his examples is that no trained European priest would ever state that Christ was the messenger. Christ is not the messenger, Christ is the message. No highly trained or even briefly trained Italian priest, somebody who came out of an educational system, would write something like this that proceeds with such inattention and lack of knowledge of this farther tradition. And of course, I agree with both Ralph and Mehari that they are unusual texts, but also that they swim in a stream of Ethiopian texts that are elegantly argued, these are elsewhere, that are emancipatory, that are critique, that include autobiographies at the beginning. These are all things we have seen in other texts. Sometimes people say, well, how come these texts weren't known? But these texts were heretical so far as the church was concerned, so people were hiding them, they were not talking about them. So to wrap up, you know, even today, for many, hearing the words African rational philosophy immediately sparks skepticism. And some will never accept that Ethiopians or Africans could author two texts this rhetorically and argumentatively sophisticated. But for any person who is deeply familiar with Ethiopian culture and Ge'ez literature, the experience of translating these texts is profound. The longer we translated, the more this inescapable feeling group Ethiopians wrote these texts. The evidence in their wording, in their sentiment, in their outlook, in their theology, in their rhetoric, in their style, in their technique, in a textuality, and 1,000 other things is just too overwhelming. Almost every sentence had something deeply Ethiopian about it. So what we encourage you to do, we have translated this so everyone can get involved. Please read them. Please think deeply about what they are saying and how. And we really hope that this new translation allows the Hatata inquiries to take their proper place in the global history of philosophy as African texts.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy.
Jeremy, you can, do you want me to put up the slides or you want to talk for a little bit first?
I think I'd take the slides.
Well,
Okay.
Okay, then we have Jeremy Brown from Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. Okay, I guess you can continue.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I have the fortunate opportunity in this project to work with the manuscripts and to see what kind of evidence we can learn from looking at the manuscripts themselves. And an interesting place to start, and a thing that has played into this argument about the authorship of the Hatatas, are these secondary hand corrections that appear both in the manuscript 215 as well as manuscript 234. And so my hope today is to demystify some of those interventions, explain them, and then use that as an opportunity to talk about how the two manuscripts fall into a family tree, also known as a stemma. So first, for Abadai 215, which we see here on the screen, there are two layers of scribal correction that happen. The first we can see here is written by the scribe that wrote the base text. These are oftentimes just very simple corrections, and most of the time they're aligning this manuscript, which was the second one copied, with the first one copied, Abadai 234. In fact, 73% of the time, any correction in this manuscript is editing towards the text type that we have from the first manuscript that was copied. So it has been argued several times in earlier scholarship that all of these scribal interventions speak to Urbino having second thoughts about the first text that he wrote, and he's now modifying it. This isn't at all the case. These scribal interventions are being done using typical Ethiopian manuscript techniques, and they're editing towards the earlier text type that they already had. And so this speaks to an editor who's gone through and just made sure that the scribe didn't make glaring mistakes, and where they did, they fixed them using an exemplar that we know they already had, that we know that Urbino had already bought and made a copy of. So these are not that mystifying of scribal interventions. If we go to the second slide, we'll see there's another layer of intervention. So in a much lighter ink, and they stick out, they use this very ancient form of the ancora, this T symbol. You can go all the way back into the Greek manuscripts of the Bible, as well as the Dead Sea Scrolls, and find examples of this scribal intervention technique appearing. And again, these are being used to edit this manuscript to bring it into accordance with Abadai 234, the earlier manuscript. So these are not systematic reworkings, revamping the text. They're just fixing scribal errors. Only 9 of the scribal interventions out of the 71 in this manuscript are anything other than correcting it towards Abadai 234 or fixing spelling. And most of those are because the scribe wrote the same word twice and they erased one of the copies of it. So very simple corrections. We look at Abadai 234 in the next slide. This one is interesting and has led to some confusion because this is the manuscript that Urbino is the scribe for. So we already see that the quality of hand is quite different from the manuscript we looked at first. It's written by an Ethiopian scribe. This is written by our Italian priest. And so the hand is far less trained and has 2 scribal techniques that no Ethiopian scribe, in my experience, has ever used. The one at the top, the second to the bottom line, we see a character that's been crossed out, and then immediately following it, there's another character. This is a technique I've only ever seen Urbino use, where in some of the interchangeable letters that are in Ethiopic, namely the 3 different H's that one could use, when Urbino wrote one that wasn't the lexical form that he preferred for his dictionary, he would catch it, cross it out, and then write the preferred lexical form that he uses in his lexicon. This isn't something you would ever find an Ethiopian scribe doing because the word wasn't incorrectly spelled in the first place. So this speaks to somebody, a lexicographer, who's trying to create a text most closely related to a lexicon. Also, at the bottom, we see a very interesting technique, again, that only occurs in the manuscript scribed by Urbino. We see the word amata, year. It's been marked for erasure with a box around it. And then immediately after it is the word for months. So this shows us that Urbino introduced an error as he was copying from his exemplar, noticed it straight away, marked the word for erasure, and wrote the corrected word. Part of this is an issue with writing on paper rather than the typical parchment used by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church for their manuscripts. So if you're writing on parchment, you use a penknife, you could wash it away. Those are not erasure techniques possible with paper. And so Urbino has marked it for erasure. It's also a vote against Urbino being some super savant of Gez who learned it so quickly that he's now a master of composition. He's making basic errors that your second-year Ethiopic student would probably get in trouble with from their professor or instructor. So these are things to keep in mind, kind of a demystifying of some of these scribal interventions. And then if we could go to the last slide, I'd like to look at the stemma. So part of understanding these two manuscripts and the two copies of the Hatata Zara Yaakov is understanding that these two manuscripts have gone through some textual transmission. They have some history, and they've moved apart in their text type. The only way that this would happen is if they've been copied multiple times and allowed to have some time to transmit and change. This seems very unlikely to have taken place during the 8 months that Urbino would have had to copy these manuscripts. So we know that manuscript alpha is going to represent our autograph of the Hatata Zara Yaakov. Of course, we unfortunately don't have that, it's non-extant. But we know that manuscript beta here is the copy purchased by Urbino, scribed by Walda Yosef, and this serves as the exemplar for manuscript A, Abadai 234, which Urbino is the scribe of and sends to Dabadi, his patron. We also know that manuscript Omega, the Hatata Walda Hewot, is of course also non-extant. And then it is combined along with the Hatata Zara Yaakov and the supposed manuscript Psi that Urbino purchases. This creates the very interesting Davidi 215, where the base text is where the text is copied from manuscript Psi, but has been revised with the revisions we just looked at together against the other manuscript, manuscript Beta, that Urbino had purchased, creating this manuscript that represents Psi in the base text, but also has been revised by a secondary hand to the so-called B1 here. So these manuscripts have had time to develop. The two versions of the Hatata Zara Yaakov have changes. They've altered. It seems like the manuscript text or the text type represented in Davidi 215 has stronger wording in its anti-Islamic polemic. It has taken time to really set itself as though it's part of a tradition, a school of thought, whereas Davidi 234 is likely the earlier text type of these two. So again, they help us in understanding that these are Ethiopian texts and they were copied, transmitted, and shared over a span of centuries. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for the presentation. I feel like I've learned a lot. I hope you feel the same way as well, those of you in the audience. Now I'm going to welcome Dr. Michelle Tisdel to the stage. All right, thank you so much for coming. Before I continue, actually, I would like you to, because, okay, she does a lot. She works a lot, and she works at the, I don't know if you're okay with me saying at the National Library. Yeah, she works at the National Library, but she also has a lot of other projects that she initiates and does in her free time as well, which are amazing and wonderful. And one of the things that I really admire about her is actually trying to revive forgotten stories, and make sure that a lot of the African footsteps in Norway are not erased, which is something very important, especially in this context as well. With Hatata inquiries, there is a lot of attempts at erasure, which, well, for me personally, is very frustrating. But we need people that are, say it a certain way, well, gatekeepers, people who are working within institutions, in academia, museums, libraries, and so on, that also are putting in a lot of efforts to make sure that that tradition does not continue. So I'm very, well, I'm a huge fan, thank you. Yeah, no, I really do look up to her. But so I think I'm just going to jump into the questions now. Doug, I'll start with you. You talked about all the different texts and literature and important ideas and ideologies that have been written down that we don't really get in the Eurocentric context.
Yeah.
Why is it important to you to talk about those and to bring them forward where you can?
Right. Well, first of all, may you enter the screen, by the way? Is that possible? If you move a little bit closer.
No, I'm fine. I love you. Okay.
I was just thinking that, recording,
If
you
people
should
are
be
not
on the
seeing me,
screen.
now you can see me, and I
Yeah.
think I'm just going to go back.
Oh, really?
Thank you.
I mean, you're the star for me. I'm not just so, because you're doing great work for Afrika.no as well. Now, why it's important. Yeah, well, I guess, as you can see from this Oxford University Press, from 2020, this publication, right? So it seems like, it's helping, I mean, it's getting better the last, how to say, decade or so. But I guess Wendy might also comment on how easy or not easy it has been to, how to say, convince the academia or people in the academy to actually publish these Hatata inquiries as well. There is certainly, how to say, resistance, but then again, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, it's not only about when it comes to these texts, I mean, also Chinese, Indian, Mesoamerican philosophy as well, or Ahmed Baba in Timbuktu as well, or in Nigeria, we have Nana Asma'u, born in 1793, a Nigerian Sokoto Caliphate philosopher, and she was a warrior. And another example, they are all excluded the last couple of 100 years. So there's a lot of work, is my claim, to do. I mean, there is a lot to do in order to, how to say, get back to a, how to say, pre-colonial worldview, or at least a non-colonial. Maybe not everything was, before the 1600s, but I mean, some things were better before so-called scientific racism was invented, from the 1750s, mostly, with David Hume, Carl von Linné, a Swedish guy, and I think it's important because, I don't think it's that important necessarily for, how to say, Africans or Asians. I think it's maybe, this might be a little provocative, but I think it's mostly important for, how to say, white people, to actually learn that other people also do philosophy and Thomas Hobbes wrote in 1651 that, philosophy was a trade or a discipline of the Asians and the Africans. And only later on did philosophy enter the Greek system, So it was a completely different worldview. And there is so much problem with white supremacy thinking and racism. And I do seriously think that the academy, this is my claim, is a very vital part of the contribution to racism in the society today.
Yeah, well, thank you. Michelle, how do you see Norwegian academia in this context? Do you feel like, where are we?
I think Dag is correct to say that there's a lot of resistance. We only need to look back to 2020 to some of the calls for decolonizing different curricula. That's one of the most recent and one of maybe the most one of the controversies that played out most in the media here in Norway, particularly in the Oslo region in the summer, fall of 2020, particularly at the Art Academy, and other examples of students and activists, sometimes students as activists, sometimes separate groups, raising the issue of many terms have been used. The most common term at that time was decolonizing academia, curriculum, discourses, institutions, education in general. And it's a greatly misunderstood, demand. But I think that this work and the work that has been done on this volume is a great contribution and illustrates basically the essence of what decolonizing the academy and decolonizing education and decentering European knowledge production as the norm and the standard, and as something that defines the history of knowledge production in general. This is the work that's been done, not only because it's collaborative, but the way, particularly in the introduction, Wendy, that you go through and you lay out the claims about authored by Europeans versus authored by Ethiopians. It illustrates what it means to decolonize something, to decenter. It's really about updating our knowledge, updating our information, as in different societies based on new relevant research, new relevant primary sources, new accessibility that we enjoy because of digitization and other similar technological advances. So I think that there is still quite a bit of resistance here in Norway in academia and also in our cultural institutions to see the value in, stewarding the care of non-Norwegian and non-European collections that a lot of institutions in Europe have somehow become responsible for through different processes. And I think it's of vital importance, not only for the societies who are managing these collections, but also for the minoritized populations in those societies to feel that their histories and their collections are also being cared for, being studied, being shared. And I think that I agree with Dag's assessment of that here, and in its ability to continue to support ideologies of Eurocentrism and white supremacy.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm gonna come to you and Ralph and Wendy. The reason I come to you is because we have this idea that the US and the UK are so much farther than us, and they have, they're progressive than us, that there's that idea because, a lot of, let's say, the colonial knowledge or more critical knowledge, when we want to find books and whatever articles, we see in your direction. So my question then is, how you know, from people on the other side, how do you see your context? Is there resistance? Do you feel like there's a, you know, there people have progressed and are willing to take in more, you know, non-Eurocentric, you know, this is knowledge that does not center Europe? What is it like there? Wendy, you can
You wanna
start.
go first? Yeah.
I was thinking it's funny in the US, we always think, oh, Norway, the progressive land of healthcare, etc. Like, and we're like, what?
No,
You guys
no.
have this as a worse problem? I mean, I honestly feel that the US is kind of the major generator from the beginning of racist rhetoric, and that having enslaved peoples, that the desire to justify it and so on is just, you know, bone deep, and that it works itself out in incredibly systemic ways. Even the prison system in the US, you know, this basically kind of modern slavery. So I guess don't think that we're that more advanced. I mean, I guess you could say maybe there's a much bigger block of people who have a racist agenda, and there definitely are, you know, and especially African Americans who've led the charge since the 1800s in terms of trying to decolonize and to, you know, combat racism and so on. So in that sense, I agree. There are many incredible scholars who've been working for a long time and doing really amazing work of, you know, theorizing and attacking racism.
Thank you. Ralph?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's patchy here that we have institutions. I was counted it a privilege to have studied at SOAS, where many of the School of Oriental African Studies, which foundations were to staff the British Foreign and Colonial Service, but reinvented itself as a place where you study from the world from a non-Western perspective. And I think it's done a very good job of that, and has incredible diversity both in its alumni and in its faculty. But then there are other places. I had a conversation with somebody that I don't want to name them here, but saying, you know, wouldn't it be really interesting to have a dialogue between the sorts of theology that we've done here in the West and the sorts of theology Christian theology as it's developed in Ethiopia? They were quite a senior person, and they basically said, well, why would we do that? Yeah. The implication being they, meaning the Ethiopians, have to learn from us because we've got it all sorted. So those views are still there. And so it's very easy to see people prejudging, which is really what I said at the beginning, that we can be far too quick. We have our categories that work in many ways for literature from certain sources, but we have to be much more open-minded. Let our right brains sort of just ponder and see things in an integrated way before we break it down with our left brains and pull it apart. I think still. So again, there are people who have really worked hard at challenging these what are undoubtedly racist assumptions, and in many cases as well, just ignorance. That's also a factor. But I think many people run with them still consistently and make statements which are sort of, I mean, as you were talking, Wendy, I was thinking something that hadn't occurred to me before, that, you know, scholars working with this work have tried to prove that some of the syntax is European language syntax. Yes. Well, with 155 quotations from a Bible that's translated from Greek. Yes. So we do see odd sentence constructions. Almost all of the odd sentences are because the Bible is pretty much a word-for-word literal translation from the Greek. So yes, there is European language embedded in the Hatata, but it's not because it's faked. It's because of a long tradition of translating the Bible into the vernacular that the Orthodox churches were very keen on in the early days. So again, people are good at making observations. The Italian scholars that did a lot of work on Ethiopian literature did some incredible work on them. But then it's the assumptions that they make and conclusions that they draw that we need to find some fault with. So we have a long way to go over here, I think, still.
Thank you. So, I mean, everyone now, every person on this panel, you're all doing your part in that process, right? So my question then is, what is working? Because I think this is a good platform to exchange knowledge, right? You're all in different settings, work in different types of institutions, although similar, but still. What is working, and what do we need to do to, let's say, speed up the process, encourage more change? I don't know, you call it.
Mehari.
Mehari?
Okay, thank you. That's I think $1 million question, literally and figuratively. Because yeah, there is a lot of research that needs to be done, and that requires a lot of resource, and whoever controls the resource usually controls the orientation of the process of the research. And this is the academic life, or this is how academia functions in my perception in the Western world. So to ask to do those research, like very important research endeavors, yeah, probably the first thing we might have to think is, how do we liberate Western academia from the control of some financial donors? That is, I think that is whether it's governments or corporations or whatever that is. Like, how can Western academia be a free academia where people can think freely, and their thoughts are scaled or weighed based on the benefit that they contribute to humanity worldwide? I think that is the first thing that needs to be addressed. Then I think as academicians, we might not have that much of power to solve that, like individually. So what can we do as individual academicians? I think the first thing would be learning, or starting to ask the important questions, the benefiting questions, than these very redundant and often for me exhausting, like very exhausting questions, which are really futile. In Amharic, we have this expression called gunch alfa krikker, or gunch al, something that really just wears your cheeks out. Like this kind of, yeah, this kind of questions, which really don't contribute that much to human thought. So I think we have to learn to ask those more benefiting, more edifying questions. And to do that, we have always, I think, to rethink and get out of the frameworks that are already given to us and placed as a dominant discourse in African studies, like Ethiopian studies in particular, like this obsession. What was the original text? Could this be a translation from such and such language? As interesting as that could be for some people, I think the more important question would be, wait, what does this text do in the living community and in its living tradition? What does this text do? What is the meaning that it conveys? What is the meaning that is constructed out of this text from by the people? I think these kind of questions would allow us to benefit from the treasure that exists. And like everybody might be like, oh, such a great treasure. And like, when are we going to study it? When are we going to study in depth? Like not just like, oh, this was these are the manuscripts that were found and they were 50, and this was the how the letter was written in this manuscript, and in the other one it is a little twisted to the left or to the right. As great as that is, when are we going to move a little further and to ask a little in-depth questions? I think those would be my invitations for people, and yeah, and enjoy the academic life of studying Ethiopian thought, Ethiopian theology, and yeah, I think these are the two things that I would like to say. And thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
I think independent initiatives are very important because what I've learned is, or what I've observed is that institutions, the academies, often the formal institutionalized, what should I say, actors that we have can't do everything. And as people have mentioned already, instead of, I don't know, continuing to knock on closed doors and petition for different kinds of actions, that I'm very happy to see a lot of private initiatives, both inside and outside of academia and outside of state-funded institutions here in Norway, where people are responding to their own interests and their own thirst for knowledge, and they are creating their own study groups and circles and book clubs and archival and documentation initiatives in order to forward and advance their quest for knowledge and share that knowledge with each other in society. And while I'm speaking to how should I say it? No shade. I'm not throwing shade against towards the academy. However, I'm just being honest in the sense that there are limitations, as we all know. So we have to all work from where we are and make a contribution. And so I'm personally very interested in creating a shorter pathway from research to public education, for example. Right. It takes way too long for knowledge to find its way to the public. If one is not enrolled in university, reading scholarly texts, reading academic journals, how can we cut down the amount of time that it takes for research, information from research to reach the public? And by the public, I mean younger audiences, older audiences, I mean everyone. So it really, from my point of view, requires different interested people to work across their professional groups and across communities to find new audiences who can benefit from the work that's being done. So academicians who are willing to step outside of academia and to engage more directly and translate their research findings into more accessible forms for broader audiences is extremely important. Extremely important. If the collections and the work that we do are going to directly impact society, then we have to, in addition to talking to each other, we have to talk directly to the public. So I'm very much for continuing to find ways for us to work across our professional groups and to work with other actors in society who are as invested as we are in having new knowledge play a greater role in our understanding and impact in society.
Well, thank you so much, because that was really great. But I do have one thing to follow up on that, because I love what you said just now, that we need to talk across sectors and disciplines, but also reach out to people outside of that space. And something that I usually discuss with my friends is accessibility. And while all of this is really wonderful, I see that, I mean, we read a lot of things, but not everything is easy to read. So how do we, because I can see that the youth is very hungry for that type of knowledge. The youth is, you know, they're very engaged and very interested, but not everything is accessible. If we want books, let's say they're willing to read, it's expensive. And if they have access to it, then it's also like the language is difficult, and like it can be a bit dry sometimes, academia. So how do we make knowledge like this accessible? That I do have, that's a genuine question. I really wonder.
Well, you know what, one of my answers, some of my answers to that are, you know, there's not enough in Norway, at least, and I assume this is the case in the United States. There's a deficit of factual non-fiction literature for younger audiences about important issues. So I'm a strong believer in exhibitions as well, as you know. So I think there are many ways that that information can be tailored to different audiences, age appropriate, interest appropriate. So even though it's a very sophisticated and seemingly inaccessible subject, I think there's a lot of fascinating about the process, about primary sources, about our archival materials in general, that would be fascinating to a broad range of audiences. So it's really about how to package the information, different pieces of the information, repackage it and use it in other forms of storytelling, fact-based storytelling that would appeal to different audiences. That's probably one of the easiest ways, or the simplest methods, I think.
Yeah. Jeremy, do you have anything to add to that?
It makes me also grateful for where I work, being able to work as a part of Himmel, where our mission is to make every month 1,000 or more new image sets of manuscripts with cataloging information available to folks. That our hope is that this makes more things accessible, more things to read, more things to engage and wrestle with and learn from manuscript cultures across the globe. And so it's it makes me grateful to be working in a time period where the digitization efforts are happening. There's a wealth of things to learn from in our home offices or our computers and phones, that we're able to engage with so many more interesting manuscripts and book cultures. So it makes me hopeful that there are good things ahead.
Anyone wants to add to that? Yeah, Ralph?
Well, I agree with all of that. And I think there's some really important things for academics in the West. I agree with everything that was said about access and private initiatives and so on. I think one of my greatest inspirations as a Westerner trying to engage with this was a man called Roger Cowley. I think some of us will be familiar with Roger Cowley. Interesting. So Roger Cowley was sent as a missionary to Ethiopia, and it's cutting a long story short. So if I gloss over some things here, forgive me. But he was sent to teach the Bible to Orthodox Christians. Now, Roger Cowley was courageous, and I think that's what I want to ask of Western scholars, because he stopped and he asked the question, how do Ethiopians read the scriptures? So rather than just going in and giving his standard lessons, and he produced, I mean, this is his sort of the final publication that he produced on Ethiopian biblical interpretation, which earned him a Doctor of Divinity, a high doctorate degree from Cambridge here. And I think what was remarkable about Roger was that he was very capable. I never met him. He died, sadly, quite young. He was very capable. He was very brilliant, but he was also prepared to learn from others. And one of the other things that's maybe a lesson for other African contexts as well, is that the traditional scholars of Ethiopia are people that many Westerners don't notice. I sat with a traditional scholar in a restaurant with a student of mine who's interested in Ethiopian thought, and we talked to this guy. But if you looked at him from a distance, you would think he was very ordinary. He wasn't dressed in a smart way. He wouldn't present himself. He was a humble man. And so we need to learn to have eyes to see and ears to hear. And we can only do that with what I would call cultural counselors like Mehari, who teach us to look. So we've got to be working with people, yes, and we've got to be opening our ears and our eyes in new ways, and to be courageous. And you know, the work that you've done as well, and the Jeremy and myself and Wendy as well have been associated with a guy called Steve De La Mata, has worked very courageously and in ways that have been to him in many different ways costly, to promote things from the perspective of Ethiopia. So there are people around, but not enough yet. So we need to keep banging the drum and say, look.
Thank you so much. Before we call it a day, I do have one more question, and it is, how do we, because I mean, we love that you wrote this book, and I hope more people here will have the opportunity to read it, but how do we get knowledge like that in academia in Norway? Because I'm really concerned about the state of academia in Norway. I was so demotivated going to school. I basically just kind of chased me away, really. Because it was just such a white space. It was too much. So how do we bring in knowledge that is more attractive to people like me, you know? I do wonder, do you have any suggestions to that? Yes?
Well, I just want to mention that we did actually invite several people from the University of Oslo, but they were not interested. Except
one person, yeah.
Except the dean, actually, at the humanities faculty. His name is Frode Helland, thank you. And so he has written actually about racism himself, a book, actually. But except of him, I mean, we asked the philosophers, a historian of Addis, people working on history of Addis, but you know, they're not interested in this book. And I guess my claim, I know how they are thinking, so to say, is that maybe they feel this is some kind of threat, you know, because it says that, you know, that the curriculum and the reading list they have, that they are inadequate, you know, and there is a lot to learn, you know, also for the people at the universities of Europe, at least. But again, just a short some kind of inspiration. If we go back to the history of Ethiopia, you know, we can go back to 1417, before Columbus, right? And what happened? It was not the Europeans who discovered Ethiopia, but was the other way around, because actually there were Ethiopians going to the council in Constance, which is in the southern part of Germany, in 1417, you know, and they were exchanging ideas. They were welcome. The Ethiopians were welcome to this Christian council, you know, in 1417, and in 1470s, they were actually building this Ethiopian church in the middle of the Vatican State, or in Rome, you know, and talking about in 1534, Martin Luther, nothing good said about his anti-Semitic quotations and everything, but at least he met an Ethiopian in Germany, you know, and they were talking with each other, and he was, it sounded, it seems like they had some kind of understanding, So those were the days. It was possible in the 14 and 1500s to communicate, across the borders, and I think there should still be hope to start that process again.
Yeah, although we shouldn't be doing that in 2023, but that ideally it shouldn't have happened to begin with. But
Yeah.
Michelle, what was the question again? How do we bring in more knowledge into Norwegian academia to make it less Eurocentric?
I know this is probably not a popular answer, but I really don't know, because I struggle with that every day.
That's about it.
And I don't know. That's a question that I receive, that I think about all the time. And there are trends. There you have the usual trends. Right now, what's very trendy, one of the many trendy new turns in some disciplines is now to study Norwegian, Danish Norwegian, and Danish colonial practices during the transatlantic slave trade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But just 5 years ago, suggesting that should be something that you would study here in Norway was, highly unpopular. But in the span of 5 years, I just received an email just yesterday about, a new research project that's doing that, or a new book that's coming out that the scholars are doing that. So there's a lot of trends. So I think maybe I would say that come with a warning instead of a suggestion, and it's just to be aware and be wary of trends, of the trends in academia, and rather focus on long-term scholarly engagement goals. For example, this work, again, for me represents a long-term, a deep, caring interest in understanding and uncovering new knowledge about inquiries into epistemology, the philosophy. And someone mentioned there's two different areas of interest that this work, at least two, represents. One is the regional interest, the interest in Ethiopian traditions, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other is more broadly in, the interest in philosophy and the history of philosophical thought. So this work represents several, long-term engagements and a curiosity about this human about our history and our humanity and thought, the evolution of thought. So rather continuing to inspire and collaborate on projects and research of that nature, as opposed to trends, because the trends come and go. Money comes with trends, but then the money disappears when the trend disappears. So I guess the only definitive thing that I can say is to be wary of the trends and to continue to stay committed to the more deeper, long-term academic and scholarly and pursuits of knowledge. So I just want to thank you all for your contribution to the work. I've come through the introduction, the preface, and the very detailed introduction. I love it that it's such a detailed introduction, and I can't wait to continue to engage with the book. So thanks for inviting me to comment.
Absolutely, thank you. The panel that are joining us digitally, anything you want to add here, or?
Just to say, thank you. It's Michelle, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, thank you so much for your kind words. Nothing could make me happier than to hear that you like the long introduction. I'm like, oh, good. I think people do translate, but they just translate. There's no notes, there's no introduction, and they don't provide that kind of contextual information. And, we did a lot also so that I want it to be a democratic process. I want it to be translated in such a way where people can come in and contest it, even if they don't really know the language, you know? So we'll have in the notes, here's other ways you could have translated this. And that to me is really important. And I also entirely wholeheartedly agree with your point about getting the word out, not just siloing it. And in particular, getting it out to young people who are being, you know, oppressed with this myth that Africa has no history, no writing, no anything. And these are really important works to just, you know, obliterate that kind of racist idea.
Thank you, Wendy. Mehari, it seemed like you wanted to say something.
Yes, Rahwa, thank you. Thank you for this gathering. And I was just laughing when every time this kind of ridiculous ideas come up, like, oh, Africa, you know, there is nothing this, there is not this, there is not like no philosophy, not thinking. Like, okay, how about human beings? Do they exist there? That's the question that I just would like to ask. Do they exist there? If we agree that they exist there, then don't forget, everything is possible. So I think that is the premise, that or the deep down assumption that needs to be challenged. And my invitation for anybody who is interested in engaging and studying like African thoughts, African theology, philosophy, is like African texts, is there is some challenging environment that you will be facing when you come to Western academia, of course. But you know what? It's worth it. It's worth it. And there is pain. Like, no pain, no gain. Like, there is pain, but trust me, through the works that you do, through the works of this generation, across the world, the next generation will have a better academia, a much better knowledge than what there was when we came into the field. We stand in the show, like we are standing on the shoulder of the giants, and we might not be the giants, but we definitely will hold up a little taller when the next generation comes up. We will hold them up a little taller if we keep doing the work. So I really encourage Rahwa and everyone else who is interested in this, in engaging African thoughts and African treasures, to be courageous. You be the change.
Thank you so much, man.
Bye.
Well, if no one has anything more to add, I think we're going to conclude here, because I believe we're out of time. You know, we could keep on talking forever, but I mean, because I'm sure like even the audience had questions for you, but then there were some things that we need to discuss. But hopefully maybe we'll get to do this again sometime. Thank you so much for your contribution. Thank you so much for using your time to join us, the two of you as well. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you, the audience, for coming, both you, the ones that are here in real life, and those joining us on online. So thanks, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye all.